It's November 1923, and you're standing inside a bakery in Berlin. You look up at the price board behind the counter, and your brain can't even process what you're seeing. A single loaf of bread costs 200 billion marks. Not 200, not 200,000, 200 billion. The woman in front of you isn't carrying a purse, she's pushing a wheelbarrow full of cash just to buy milk. You wait in line for 12 minutes. When you finally reach the front, the baker takes a piece of chalk, crosses out the old price, and writes 250 billion. The currency lost 30% of its value while you stood there doing nothing. This isn't some fictional nightmare. This was real life in the Weimar Republic. And here's what should terrify you. It keeps happening. Venezuela, 2018. A carton of eggs cost 7 million bolivars. Zimbabwe, 2008. You needed a $100 trillion bill just to pay for a bus ride. Lebanon, 2023. The currency lost 98% of its value in 4 years, turning doctors into doormen overnight. Here's the thing that haunts me every single night. The question isn't if your currency will collapse. History shows us the question is when. The average lifespan of any paper currency is just 27 years. The US dollar has been off the gold standard since 1971. You can do that math yourself. So here's what actually matters. When the rules of money get completely rewritten overnight, and they will, what holds value? What keeps you from losing everything? I spent months digging through economic disasters spanning over a century. Weimar Germany, Venezuela, Lebanon, Zimbabwe. I pulled the financial forensics, not theories. Not predictions, historical facts. By the time you finish this video, you'll know exactly which 5 types of assets survived when entire empires burned to the ground, and which ones evaporated faster than a currency in hyperinflation. Stay with me, because what I'm about to show you could be the difference between keeping your wealth and watching it vanish. Before we get into the assets themselves, you need to understand something fundamental. Currency collapse follows a pattern. It's mathematical, it's predictable. Every single collapse moves through the same 5 stages. Stage 1. The government spends more money than it collects in taxes. Stage 2. It starts printing money to cover the gap. Stage 3. The currency begins losing purchasing power slowly at first. Stage 4. People panic and flee to alternatives. Stage 5. Complete collapse. Every time, without exception. Weimar Germany went from 320 marks per dollar in mid-1922 to 4.2 trillion marks per dollar by November 1923. That's a 98% loss of value in just 18 months. Venezuela's bolivar went from 10 per dollar to over 1 million per dollar in a decade. Lebanon's pound collapsed from 1,500 per dollar to 89,000 in 4 years. Different countries, different decades, same pattern, same stages, same catastrophic outcome. So what survived? Let me walk you through each one. The first asset is the most obvious, and yet it's the one most people still don't own enough of. Precious metals, gold and silver. The assets that governments physically cannot print and central banks cannot debase. Here's the math, and it's brutal in its clarity. During the Weimar collapse, if you held paper marks, you lost everything. 100%. Complete annihilation. But if you held gold, you maintained your purchasing power entirely. An ounce of gold bought you the same basket of goods before the hyperinflation, during the hyperinflation, and after the hyperinflation. The currency changed. Gold didn't budge. Same exact pattern in Zimbabwe. When Mugabe's regime started printing those $100 trillion notes, anyone holding gold was protected. Same thing in Venezuela. While the bolivar became worthless, gold retained its value. And we're watching this happen right now in Turkey. Late 2024 data shows that gold deposit accounts at Turkish banks surged from 1.36 trillion lira to 2.72 trillion lira in just 3 months. That's a doubling in 1 quarter. Why? Because Turkish citizens see the pattern forming: runaway inflation, currency debasement. And they're running to the only asset that survived every single collapse in human history. Here's what people who criticize gold completely miss. Gold doesn't need to do anything. It doesn't need to pay dividends. It doesn't need earnings reports. Its entire purpose is to not be debased. When the supply of paper currency explodes, the purchasing power of each unit collapses. Gold supply can't be arbitrarily expanded, so it becomes relatively more valuable by default. Not because gold changed, but because everything else got destroyed. During the 2008 financial crisis, gold actually crashed initially. It fell hard when liquidity froze up, but once the dust settled, and it rose 166% in less than 3 years. Silver did even better, 448%. During the 1970s stagflation, gold fell almost 50% mid-decade, bottomed out in 1976, then surged 440% over the next 3 years. Pattern recognition, verified, undeniable. The mechanism is simple and brutal. Precious metals are insurance against monetary system failure, not speculation, insurance. You hold them because they do nothing except preserve purchasing power when everything else is burning. The second asset that survives is foreign hard currencies. When your domestic currency is dying, the escape valve is holding someone else's stable money. Let me take you to Beirut in October 2019. You're a nurse. You've saved $50,000 over a decade of hard work. And the Lebanese pound has been pegged at 1,507 per dollar since 1997. Rock solid for 22 years. You trust the system. Then the peg breaks. August 2019, the black market rate hit 1,600. April 2020, 3,000. March 2021, 14,000. By 2025, the official rate is 89,000 per dollar. Your $50,000 in pound-denominated savings is now worth $1,000. You lost 98% of your purchasing power, while the number in your bank account stayed exactly the same. But here's the twist. Your colleague, another nurse working right next to you, kept her savings in US dollars, physical cash, outside the banking system. She maintained 100% of her purchasing power. And not because the dollar was magical, she could have used Swiss francs or euros, but because she held a currency that wasn't collapsing. This pattern repeats everywhere you look. Zimbabwe dollarized itself before the government even made it official. People completely abandoned the Zimbabwe dollar and started using US dollars for everything. Ecuador did the same thing in 2000 after a financial crisis. El Salvador in 2001. Panama has been dollarized since 1904. Venezuela right now, Venezuelans use dollars for major purchases, even though the bolivar is still technically legal tender. Argentina, you buy property in dollars, not pesos. Cambodia, ATMs dispense US dollars, not riel. This isn't policy, this is survival. When domestic currency fails, rational people switch to stable foreign currency. The government can mandate whatever it wants, and people vote with their wallets. The lesson is crystal clear. Access to foreign currency during a crisis is complete protection. A person holding dollars during the Lebanese collapse maintained their wealth. A person holding pounds lost 98%. That's not market volatility. That's the difference between survival and annihilation. The third asset is counterintuitive, and it separates people who truly understand currency collapse from those who don't. Productive equities, stocks, ownership in real companies with real assets. Here's what blows people's minds. Venezuela's stock market rose over 3,400% in 2024. The Caracas Stock Exchange surged from 2,082 points to over 6,000 in 9 trading days in January 2026. Individual stocks went parabolic. Mercantil Servicios Financieros up 200%, CanTV up 219%, Banco Provincial up 171%. You're probably thinking, wait, the economy is collapsing and stocks are skyrocketing. That makes no sense. Wrong. It makes perfect sense once you understand what stocks actually are. A stock isn't a piece of paper. It's ownership in real assets, factories, equipment, inventory, land. When currency collapses, the nominal price of those assets rises to match inflation because the assets themselves haven't disappeared. They're still there. They're still producing. Imagine a Venezuelan manufacturing company worth $100 million in real productive capacity. When the exchange rate goes from 10 bolivars per dollar to 30 bolivars per dollar, and the stock price rises from 1 trillion bolivars to 3 trillion bolivars. Not because the company became more valuable in real terms, but because it takes more bolivars to equal the same dollar amount. But here's the critical distinction most people completely miss. Not all stocks survive equally. Only companies with revenue streams diversified away from the collapsing economy maintain real value. A company earning 100% of its revenue in bolivars sees its real profitability collapse even as its nominal stock price rises, because it has to convert worthless bolivars back into dollars to buy foreign inputs. Conversely, a company that exports 50% of its production receives dollar revenues directly. Its bolivar costs decline in real terms, while dollar revenues stay stable. A real profitability actually improves during devaluation. For shareholders, this becomes a genuine inflation hedge. Research on Latin America's 1982 crisis, Mexico's peso crisis of 1994, and Asia's 1998 meltdown confirms this. Direct investors operating manufacturing facilities that could redirect sales from local markets to export markets survived and thrived. Other investment forms plummeted into negative territory. The key was export capability, so the lesson: productive equities with international revenue streams aren't just survivors, they're beneficiaries of currency collapse. But domestic-only companies, they burn with the currency. The fourth asset that survives is consumables and barter goods. When the formal monetary system fails completely, economic activity doesn't stop. It reorganizes around different media of exchange. The post-World War II Germany, the Reichsmark was so worthless it was effectively abandoned. People traded goods for cigarettes, coal, potatoes. Cigarettes became particularly prominent as a temporary currency. American soldiers bought cigarettes from army exchange stores for pennies and traded them with Germans for goods and services worth exponentially more. Why cigarettes? They were standardized, easily divisible, non-perishable, lightweight, widely accepted. They had all the properties of money except one: a government didn't issue them. Black markets near train stations in big German cities operated 24/7, trading everything from railway tickets to forged documents, with cigarettes as the medium of exchange. Here's the economic proof. when large shipments of Red Cross packages arrived at prisoner of war camps, sometimes injecting hundreds of thousands of cigarettes into the camp's money supply at once, it caused inflation in cigarette prices. Same mechanism as fiat currency expansion. More cigarettes chasing the same goods equals higher cigarette prices. Fast forward to Venezuela 2018. As the bolivar became worthless, Venezuelans engaged in pure barter. Fishermen traded their catch for flour just to feed their kids. Items that held value: medical supplies, food, water, fuel, batteries, lighter fluid, basic tools. Anything with immediate consumption value or that enabled essential functions. During supply chain disruptions, even toilet paper, soap, and wet wipes became valuable. Not for comfort, but for health. Staying clean prevented infection spread during systemic failure. But here's the limitation: consumables get consumed. They can't serve as long-term stores of value. You can't build a wealth portfolio on aspirin and batteries. They're tactical, not strategic. The optimal allocation: a small portion in physical necessities for immediate exchange value during acute crisis phases, but the bulk of your wealth in assets that don't evaporate when used. The fifth asset is agricultural land, the immobile store of value that produces the one thing humans cannot live without: food. During the Great Depression, farmers had survival advantages over urban dwellers that were stark and undeniable. Farm families raised gardens, canned fruit from orchards, had milk and cream from dairy cattle, chickens for meat and eggs. They could do without new clothing and consumer goods, but they faced one brutal constraint: they still had to pay taxes and debts to banks in cash. In this dynamic plays out in every modern collapse. Venezuela, those owning agricultural land maintained capacity to produce food regardless of currency fluctuations. Those owning urban commercial real estate faced tenants who couldn't pay rent in any meaningful terms. Land produces calories. Urban real estate produces rent denominated in collapsing currency. Calories win. But, and this is critical, agricultural land has severe vulnerabilities. First, it's utterly illiquid. You cannot move it. You cannot quickly sell it. If political circumstances deteriorate and ownership becomes unsafe, you're stuck. Zimbabwe, 2000. Mugabe's land seizure program simply revoked commercial farmers' property rights by decree. Farms were redistributed without compensation. Sophisticated operations were destroyed. In agricultural output collapsed 60% over a decade. The farm's aggregate value declined by 75% between 2000 and 2001 alone. Second vulnerability: taxation. A person holding urban commercial real estate in a collapsing currency may be forced to sell at a fraction of previous value just to raise cash for property taxes. Land cannot hide. Governments know where it is and can tax it into oblivion. Third, agricultural land that produces export crops is superior to land producing only for domestic consumption. Export crops sell for stable currency. Domestic crops sell for collapsing local currency. So the strategy: own land that's either productive and capable of generating export revenue, located outside the jurisdiction of the collapsing currency, or held through a corporate structure that protects against seizure or direct taxation. Agricultural land maintains fundamental value through its capacity to produce food, but it's less liquid and more vulnerable to government interference than precious metals or portable equities. Now let's talk about what goes to zero, because understanding what fails is just as important as knowing what survives. Number 1 with a bullet: fixed income securities denominated in the collapsing currency, bonds, treasury notes, anything where you're a creditor to a failing state. Weimar Germany, bondholders who held government bonds in marks, saw their investment become worthless as the marks used to pay interest and principal evaporated. Argentina 2001. Bondholders saw nominal value cut by 70% in debt restructuring. Even this reduced value could only be collected after years of legal disputes. The fundamental problem: fixed income securities are a claim against the collapsing currency itself. When the currency collapses, the claim becomes worthless. This isn't market failure. This is logical consequence. Number 2, savings accounts in domestic currency held within failing banking systems. Lebanese deposits denominated in pounds lost more than 95% of value as the pound devalued from $1,500 per dollar to $89,000 per dollar by 2025. Bank customers who placed savings in pound deposits in 2019 retained 2% of original purchasing power by 2024. The nominal amount stayed the same. The value disappeared. History is unambiguous. Being a creditor to a failing state is the fastest route to 100% wealth destruction. So where are we seeing these warning signs right now? Because pattern recognition only matters if you can identify the setup before it executes. Iraq, financial crisis due to lack of cash liquidity. More than 70% of monetary supply has diminished due to banking restrictions on withdrawals. The dinar devalued from 1,190 per dollar to unofficial rates approaching 1,750. Public distrust of banks, currency smuggling across borders. This is stage 3 behavior. Turkey, gold deposit accounts more than doubled in a single quarter as citizens fled to precious metals. Runaway inflation, currency debasement. This is stage 4 behavior. Currency substitution has begun. In Lebanon, 98% currency collapse already executed. Banking system technically insolvent. This is stage 5, complete failure. And then there's the elephant in the room, the United States, 38 trillion in debt. Debt to GDP ratio expanding unsustainably. Interest payments on national debt now higher than military spending. The dollar's share of global foreign exchange reserves has fallen from 80% in the mid-1970s to 65% now. Same path British sterling travelled during its decline as the world's reserve currency. In 1913, Britain was the world's biggest creditor. Within 40 years, it became a net debtor, and the dollar replaced sterling. The pattern is visible if you're willing to look. So here's the brutal truth. Currency collapse isn't hypothetical, it's historical norm. The average fiat currency lasts 27 years. 99% of all currencies that have ever existed no longer exist. The question isn't if your currency will fail. The question is whether you'll have positioned yourself to survive when it does. The 5 assets that survived every collapse since 1923. 1. Precious metals, the universal store of value. 2. Foreign hard currencies, the escape valve. 3. Productive equities with export revenue, the beneficiaries of devaluation. 4. Consumables and barter goods, tactical liquidity when systems freeze. 5. Agricultural land, the calorie generator, the assets that went to zero. 1. Fixed income securities in domestic currency, creditor wipeout. 2. Savings accounts in collapsing currency, purchasing power annihilation. The lesson isn't to abandon domestic assets entirely. It's not to become a doomsday prepper hoarding gold in a bunker. The lesson is that genuine diversification requires holding different forms of value that respond differently to monetary system failure. A portfolio consisting entirely of equities in a single country faces catastrophic risk if that country experiences currency collapse. A portfolio consisting entirely of bonds denominated in a collapsing currency will be destroyed. A genuinely diversified portfolio includes exposure to precious metals as insurance, foreign currency assets to protect against currency-specific risk, productive equities with international revenue streams, and possibly real assets in stable jurisdictions. The contemporary warning signs in Iraq, Turkey, and Lebanon suggest currency crises remain a live possibility. The US dollar remains stable, but the historical record provides abundant evidence this status cannot be taken for granted indefinitely. The most prudent approach isn't to panic, it's to recognize the pattern and position accordingly. Sufficient diversification across different asset classes and jurisdictions means no single failure scenario can destroy your purchasing power entirely. History has the answers. You just have to be willing to look at the autopsies before you become the next case study. The pattern is mathematical, predictable. The only question is whether you'll see it coming or be standing in line at the bakery, wondering how bread costs 200 billion marks. Now, go diversify before you're forced to.